The Trumpet Daily program begins right now.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Trumpet Daily radio show. I'm Sam Livingston. Mr. Stephen Flurry is on his way back from Israel today, so he's obviously had a few subs going this week, and I'm thankful for the opportunity to step in for today's show. He should be back on the air live for tomorrow's show on Friday. On today's show, I'd like to give a brief update on the latest regarding impeachment, and mixed in a little bit with that, I'd like to get into the merits of President Trump asking for the former Vice President Joe Biden to be investigated, and a little bit more on the infamous quid pro quo. There's some sound bites that I think are very valuable from some of Alan Dershowitz's defense from Tuesday. A little later on, I'll talk a bit more about John Bolton's book and that greatly timed leak that came Sunday night, and the ever-enduring deep state. How did the contents of that book already leak? How was it so perfectly timed? And did Adam Schiff know it was coming ahead of time? And then to conclude the show, I will talk about President Obama's attack on the Trump campaign, building that mostly around Mr. Gerald Flurry's latest article. This is a huge article. I printed it off. It's 13 pages long. I highly recommend that you print that off and study that. It's in the neighborhood of 6,000 words. It is a must-read, as is everything from Mr. Flurry. And I'll go ahead and take a look at that article and line it up with some even more recent news that has happened just since it was written. Trump's defense team finished up its opening arguments on Tuesday. That was January 28th. The next phase is now open questions. The senators get to interrogate the prosecutors and the defense. Following that, there will be, they've limited it to a 4-hour debate, if I remember correctly, about whether or not to call witnesses. That will happen, I believe, Friday will be that vote. So Wednesday, yesterday, and today, Thursday, they will be debating and open questions. And then hopefully on Friday, we can settle the matter of whether or not to hear from more witnesses. And of course, I'll talk a little bit more about that in just a bit, and how you see the same recurring pattern. It's the same tactic that they used in the Kavanaugh hearing. Suddenly this bombshell evidence comes on the scene just as the trial is about to wrap up, that extends it another week. Just as a side note here, to really highlight how hated the Republicans are, or how hated the Trump administration is by the radical left, I saw just a few snippets and actually quite a few articles about this Saturday Night Live skit that depicted Mitch McConnell and Alan Dershowitz visiting Satan in hell to get legal counsel for Trump's defense team. And I thought, well, if you really understand the spiritual significance of what we're dealing with, there's a lot of irony in a skit like that. But look at the division and the tension that is boiling here. That humor is incredibly divisive. The snippets that I saw of it, it's not even well thought out humor. It's just very evil looking, and to set up those public figures like they're making deals with the devil, I think, or is just obviously so divisive for this country. And it looks like there are a few Republicans that are wavering, as usual. I believe they have a 4 or 5 seat majority, and they just need 51 votes to really end this entire thing. But there's always the waffling individuals. For Kavanaugh, it was Jeff Flake. I think now it's Mitt Romney and a few others, the never-Trumpers there. And now they're on the fence. Well, that Bolton leak is a big deal. I think we should just have some witnesses. It's still open-ended if they'll allow Bolton to come in. Well, would they also vote in favor of bringing in Hunter Biden? Now, this is obviously being dragged out much longer than it needs to be. The House, they are the Democrat-controlled House. They're the prosecutors. They did not even issue a subpoena for John Bolton to have him come in and testify. And suddenly he is now the key to this entire investigation. And by not hearing from him, the Republicans are obstructing justice. They are denying the American people the truth. It's a cover-up. Well, I think personally that they planned that ahead of time. They knew that they could use this tactic of dragging this out as long as possible. They didn't want to use all of their witnesses in the House. They couldn't even make their case. It didn't go anywhere, and a few of our sound bites will highlight just how ridiculous and how poorly argued everything they did in the House was. But it really isn't surprising that there was this bombshell leak from John Bolton, and we'll cover that, like I said, in just a little bit. But I'd like to start off with talking about this quid pro quo and play a few sound bites from Trump's defense team from Monday and Tuesday. And in all of this, think about what this gets back to. This gets back to President Trump asking President Zelensky to go ahead and look at Joe Biden. While you're conducting this investigation, I've seen a lot of things in the news. You might as well just go take a look at that as well. We'll talk about how the Democrats divined the motive from that phone call. I'd like to start here with a clip from Pam Bondi. She's on Trump's defense team. She points out how the media in, I think it was 2014 and 2015, they were raising red flags about Hunter Biden constantly. This was not something that President Trump just pulled out of a hat. Hey, Ukraine, it looks like Biden's doing well. He might be the front runner. I might have to run against him. Why don't you see what you can dig up for him on me? This was not just pulled out of a hat. This was well documented. This was well publicized by the Washington Post, by the New York Times, by ABC, by NBC. And then President Trump simply comes along and says, I've seen all these reports. I heard what Joe Biden said. This looks pretty bad. Why don't you have a look at it for me while you're investigating all of the other corruption going on there? But Pam Bondi, I think, did a great job of pulling these clips. And this is a 2-minute snippet from her testimony. And it starts with a soundbite. So we have a soundbite within a soundbite here. I'll go ahead with this clip. Again, this is from Pam Bondi, clip number 1.
Where they work is not does not reflect an endorsement by the administration or by the vice president or president, but I would refer you to the vice president's office.
The next day, the Washington Post ran a story about it. It said, the appointment of the vice president's son to a Ukrainian oil board looks nepotistic at best, nefarious at worst. Again, the appointment of the vice president's son to a Ukrainian oil board looks nepotistic at best, nefarious at worst. And the media didn't stop asking questions here. It kept going. Here's ABC.
You have to fight the cancer of corruption.
But then, something strange happened. Just 3 weeks later, a Ukrainian natural gas company, Burisma, accused of corruption, appoints Hunter Biden, seen here in their promotional videos, to their board of directors, paying his firm more than $1 million a year.
Here's more from ABC. Continued on.
And Ukraine wasn't the only country where Hunter Biden's business and his father's diplomacy as vice president intersected. It also happened in China.
This video shows Chinese diplomats greeting Vice President Biden as he arrived in Beijing in December of 2013. Right by his side, his son Hunter. Less than 2 weeks later, Hunter's firm had new business, creating an investment fund in China involving the government-controlled Bank of China. With reports, they hope to raise $1.5 billion.
In fact, every witness who was asked about Hunter Biden's involvement with Burisma agreed there was a potential appearance of a conflict of interest. Multiple House Democrat witnesses, including those from the Department of State, the National Security Council, and others, unanimously testified there was a potential appearance of a conflict of interest.
So she played those sound bites from 2014, 2015 from ABC News reports talking about Hunter Biden. So the merits of President Trump asking the Ukrainian president to look into this, he's justified in doing that. The media were wondering about it. The Obama administration itself was wondering about how to deal with the optics of this. All President Trump did, I'll go ahead and read the transcript. Read the transcript. That's what you hear from President Trump. This is from his phone call with President Zelensky. The other thing, there's a lot of talk about Biden's son, that Biden stopped the prosecution, and a lot of people want to find out about that. So whatever you can do with the Attorney General would be great. Biden went around bragging that he stopped the prosecution. So if you can look into it, it sounds horrible to me. That paragraph there, two sentences, that is enough for the Democrats to run with. That is enough. That is all they need to hear in order to try to undo the votes of 63 million people. And remember, there's nothing in that phone call about the 2020 election. I don't even think the word politics comes up. I know 2020 does not come up at all. There's nothing about saying, I want that investigation announced. There's nothing about Joe Biden being the Democrat nominee. And if you want to talk about corruption, we could get into the DNC. And as we know, President Trump's Department of Justice is currently investigating a host of former Obama officials, and most of them are not running an election. So does running a campaign, does that make you immune from an investigation? Apparently, if you're Joe Biden, it does. The crime doesn't matter. If you're President Trump, though, you can have the entire intelligence community weaponized against your campaign to spy on your campaign. There's nothing wrong with that. The double standard is disgusting. Now, this entire case is subjective. There's no concrete evidence that anything of substance happened. The Democrats simply divined President Trump's motive. Trump, they argue, is asking a foreign ally to investigate his political opponent so he can use that dirt on him in the 2020 election. They simply divined that motive. Now, we've covered this content extensively in past programs, but this really amounts to this impeachment sham is a cover-up. For the Democrats to say the Republicans are committing a cover-up, well, we know that's just lies. But this whole tactic is delay and obstruct the investigations that go back to that time period and keep distracting the media, keep distracting the American public. And it gets frustrating after a while to keep reading about how ridiculous this impeachment argument is. I'll play a clip here in just a minute of Alan Dershowitz, and he talks about the quid pro quo. I have the definition here somewhere. Here it is. A quid pro quo is a favor or advantage granted or expected in return for something. This is not unusual. This is foreign policy. This is how foreign policy is administered. Why would you give aid to a country that is corrupt? Why would you give aid to a country that hates you? You vet them. You look at them. Okay, if we're going to give you this money, you need to do that. That's not unusual. And I'll get to a few quotes from Andrew McCarthy in just a bit. you almost just want the Trump administration to just say, yeah, we did ask for it, and we had plenty of reason to ask for an investigation of Joe Biden. I think most people would agree that that should be investigated. I'll go ahead here and play this clip from Alan Dershowitz. He is on Trump's defense team, and this is a soundbite from part of his defense on January 27th.
Even if a president, any president, were to demand a quid pro quo as a condition to sending aid to a foreign country, obviously a highly disputed matter in this case, that would not by itself constitute an abuse of power. Consider the following hypothetical case that is in our news today as the Israeli Prime Minister comes to the United States for meetings. Let's assume a Democratic president tells Israel that foreign aid authorized by Congress will not be sent, or an Oval Office meeting will not be scheduled unless the Israelis stop building settlements. Quid pro quo. I might disapprove of such a quid pro quo demand on policy grounds, but it would not constitute an abuse of power. Quid pro quo alone is not a basis for abuse of power. It's part of the way foreign policy has been operated by presidents since the beginning of time.
Quid pro quo. It's part of the way foreign policy has been operated by presidents since the beginning of time. There is nothing wrong with asking for a favor and expecting something in return. Well, the Democrats ran with that for a while, but then it was too difficult for them to pronounce. It was too difficult for that to stick with the public, for that to resonate. So they had to switch it to bribery. And now bribery, well, that is explicit in the Constitution. Treason, bribery, high crimes, and misdemeanors. But bribery didn't work either. There's no factual evidence for any of this. There's no exchange. That is the fact. The fact is no investigation was announced. The fact is Ukraine got the aid. Those are the events. Whatever President Trump might have intended doesn't matter. What happens, or what happened, is what happened. But the argument now, and this shows how much of a sham this is well, it's abuse of power. And that is, as we'll cover in just a few minutes, vague. It is a political phrase. It's what's the word? Ephemeral, ethereal. It's difficult to describe what that is in legal terminology. And they hand over the articles of impeachment. There are no legal arguments. There's nothing concrete about what was done that was wrong, other than that Adam Schiff and Nancy Pelosi believe President Trump is abusing his power. One more clip here from Alan Dershowitz.
In our long history, many presidents have been accused of abusing their power. I will now give you a list of presidents who in our history have been accused of abusing their power, who would be subject to impeachment under the House manager's view of the Constitution. George Washington, refusal to turn over documents related to the Jay Treaty. John Adams, signing and enforcing the Alien and Sedition laws. Thomas Jefferson, purchasing Louisiana without congressional authorization. I'll go on. John Quincy Adams, Martin Van Buren, John Tyler, arbitrary, despotic, and corrupt use of the veto power. James Polk, here I quote Abraham Lincoln. Abraham Lincoln accused Polk of abusing his power of his office, contemptuously disregarding the Constitution, usurping the role of Congress, and assuming the role of dictator. He didn't seek to impeach him, he just sought to defeat him. Abraham Lincoln was accused of abusing his power for suspending the writ of habeas corpus during the Civil War. President Grant, Grover Cleveland, William McKinley, Theodore Roosevelt, William Taft, Woodrow Wilson, Franklin Roosevelt, Harry Truman, Jimmy Carter, Ronald Reagan, quote, concerning Iran-Contra, and now I say Professor Lawrence Tribe said the following, quote, therein lies what appears to be the most serious breach of duty by the president, a breach that may well entail an impeachable abuse of power. George H.W. Bush. The following was released today by the Clinton-Gore campaign. In the past weeks, Americans have begun to learn the extent to which George Bush and his administration have abused their governmental power for political purposes. That's how abuse of power should be used, as campaign rhetoric. It should be in statements issued by one political party against the other. That's the nature of the term. Abuse of power is a political weapon, and it should be leveled against political opponents. Let the public decide. That's true. Barack Obama, the House Committee on the Judiciary, held an entire hearing entitled Obama Administration's Abuse of Power. Now, by the standards applied to earlier presidents, nearly any controversial act by a chief executive could be denominated abuse of power.
So it's a political stunt. And the Democrats have ruined the Constitution in doing this. They have ruined impeachment by doing this. Victor Davis Hanson has a few comments on that I'll get to in just a little bit. Once you go down this path, though, you cannot go back. They have politicized the entire process. And now all it takes to impeach a president is the majority in the House. And the Republicans can do it if they win again. And we know that Bible prophecy explains that there might not be very many more elections, but you see the Constitution being demolished. It is being deconstructed. They are abusing that document. Andrew McCarthy writes about this John Bolton leak. This was January 27th, 2020. It's titled, Bolton Blows Up Trump Team's Foolhardy Quid Pro Quo Defense. For months, I've been arguing that the president's team should stop claiming there was no quid pro quo conditioning the defense aid Congress had authorized for Ukraine on Kiev's conducting of investigations the president wanted. Trials and impeachment itself are unpredictable. You don't know what previously undisclosed facts might emerge during the trial that could turn the momentum against you. So you want to mount your best defense, the one that can withstand any damaging new revelations. Here, the president's best defense has always been that Ukraine got its security aid, and President Zelensky got his coveted high-profile audience with the President of the United States. Kiev barely knew defense aid was being withheld. The very temporary delay had no impact whatsoever on Ukraine's capacity to counter Russian aggression, and Zelensky was required neither to order nor to announce any investigation of the Bidens. However objectionable the calculations that led to the delay may have been, nothing of consequence happened. Therefore, there was no impeachable offense, case closed. Nothing of consequence happened. It doesn't matter what the intent was. All we can work with are the facts and the evidence. But we are in this new age now where the Democrats can tell witnesses that they are mistaken on their own testimony. President Zelensky, he said, I didn't feel any pressure. And the Democrats have the gall to say, yes, he did. They know the inner workings of his mind, and he apparently doesn't. McCarthy goes on, if the Trump defense had taken the position that we should assume for argument's sake that the president put pressure on Ukraine, but in the end he folded, the Bolton revelation would be a big nothing. The president's team could have said it was just more of what we already knew. They could have stayed on the ground where they are strongest. Nothing happened. And he just goes on to say, well, they really should have just argued that point even more, that nothing happened, rather than even get into the quid pro quo business and just say, we did ask for that and nothing came of it. So what do you want to do about that? But now this, because they said, well, we didn't ask for a quid pro quo, we didn't ask for this, and now Bolton's book comes up and says, well, the president did ask me. Well, now we have to hear from witnesses. McCarthy talks about, well, what's the consequence of having Ukraine investigate Joe Biden anyway? I think it's like the third most corrupt country in the world. I mean, it could easily be knocked down by the Biden campaign. Ukraine was making stuff up all the time during 2016. It was just as bad as Russia almost. They publicized false evidence in their ongoing investigations to actually damage the Trump campaign. I mean, even if President Trump asked them for that investigation, it's not that politically damaging to Joe Biden's campaign. But then you get all this whistleblower stuff, and it's blowing up, and it really is the Democrats. They're on their last leg here because the Mueller investigation failed, and we've played the sound bites before of Nancy Pelosi just 1 year ago saying impeachment, the case needs to be really strong, the evidence needs to be overwhelming. It's a very divisive thing. She doesn't believe any of that, but she has to say it because it's politically expedient. All she was waiting for was Mueller. And as soon as that was done, it wasn't that the radicals in her party just took over and finally convinced her to do it. It was just a matter of waiting for Mueller's thing to finish, wait for these other reports, the follow-ups to come out, and then suddenly Adam Schiff is colluding with this whistleblower, and we're on to phase 2. Another distraction to protect them, another cover-up to protect the nefarious activities going on in the Obama DOJ in 2016. I'd like to talk some more about John Bolton and this book and how it demonstrates that the deep state is still alive and well in the Trump administration. They're still working there to undermine everything that he's doing. I'll start here with just commenting on the parallels from the Kavanaugh trial. This is an article from Tristan Justice at The Federalist. It's titled, "Last Second Impeachment Game Playing is Kavanaugh 2.0. On Sunday, the New York Times published leaked details of former National Security Advisor John Bolton's upcoming book, accusing Trump of tying nearly $400 million in military aid to extracting politically motivated investigations into the Biden family. Never mind that the book leak arrived on the same day that it became available for online pre-ordering, came unsubstantiated, and surfaced from a former White House aide with an axe to grind over his removal. The late leak is reminiscent of previous attempts to sabotage the Trump presidency with unfair operations, pushing shady allegations via anonymous sources with no actual evidence, paraded as bombshells in a compliant media." Now, John Bolton writes this book. He has to give it to the National Security Council, and this is the NSC. That's the same place that our favorite witness, Lieutenant Colonel Alexander Vindman, worked, and his brother apparently works there as well. Bolton has to turn this book over to them so that they can just go through it and make sure, okay, he's not disclosing any classified information, he's not talking about anything confidential. As soon as he does that, the content of the book leaks, and we don't even know if it's actually in there. It's cited as people familiar with an unfinished manuscript of the book. Who knows what they're divining in there? And that gets leaked to the New York Times. The New York Times runs with it, and suddenly we need to have John Bolton come in and testify. We have to extend this. We have to have witnesses. If you remember what happened with Kavanaugh, it's just about to be done, and then there's another accuser. And the Democrats are demanding that we just believe all of the accusers and that we have to have an FBI investigation. And the Republicans caved and they agreed to have that investigation, and it drew it out for another week or two, and then finally they voted to confirm him. All of these tactics are just drawing out the inevitable. Mark Levin commented that he worked for Ronald Reagan and he didn't feel he had any desire to write his tell-all book. He didn't feel that desire to write it while he was working there or afterwards. But now you just see books from everyone. If they've brought coffee to anyone at the White House, they're writing a book. If they walked past the White House, they're writing a book. I mean, even the Obama officials had the the decency, well, maybe not the decency, they just knew better than to write their tell-all books while their man was in office. They waited until their boss was out of office before publishing their books. And it's so lucrative now. Everyone writes their books. They leave the White House and they go and write the book because they think they have this duty to save the country. And there's apparently bombshells that will bring down the president in every single one of these books. We hear about it for about 2 weeks. This is the one, and nothing comes of it. Well, they played that up a little bit more than the content would allow. Or they quoted someone quoting someone else, and it's hearsay. Fred Fleets, he wrote an op-ed at Fox News, and he used to work under Ambassador Bolton. The title of his article is Ambassador Bolton, Withdraw Your Book. Presidents must be able to candidly consult with their advisors without worrying they will leak these discussions to the press or obtain high-dollar book contracts to publish them. A book by a former national security advisor ahead of a president's re-election bid may set a dangerous precedent, since it could discourage future presidents from seeking advice from expert advisors on sensitive national security matters. President Trump cannot win. If he ignores the experts, the mainstream media has a field day. Well, he just takes matters into his own hands. He won't listen to his advisors. And when he does, well, they leak it all to the press. He can't have a phone call with the president of an ally, Australia, Ukraine, without having to disclose that transcript. And if you remember, the administration that said it would be the most transparent administration in history, the Obama administration, did you ever see a leak of a phone call he had with a foreign leader? Imagine if the phone call leaked of his conversation with President Rouhani of Iran. He didn't give it a chance to leak. He ran to the press room to talk about it before anything could happen. He got his narrative out there, but that administration clamped on leakers. And now it's just routine. They're all doing their public service. And once we get into Mr. Gerald Fleury's article, he talks a lot about how this is the fruits. What we are witnessing are the fruits of that administration. America under attack is still relevant. Continuing on from this Fred Fleets article, he says, I haven't seen Bolton's book manuscript and I don't know what's in it. I take Bolton and his staff at their word that they did not leak the manuscript to the New York Times, but I believe they are still responsible for this leak, since Bolton's explosive book was sent to the leak-prone National Security Council for a security review in December 2019, so the book could be published in the spring of 2020. It is also inexplicable how such a sensitive manuscript could be sent to the NSC in the middle of the impeachment process. Under such circumstances, a leak of the manuscript was all but certain. The NSC, that's where Vindman is from, and he was the one that worked with the whistleblower. It was all just a policy dispute. He was upset because the president didn't agree with him. He listened in on that call. He leaked it to Eric, I can't pronounce his name, Ciaramella or whatever, and he's the whistleblower. And that's the same agency that suddenly has John Bolton's tell-all book and isn't supposed to leak it, and then decides to, just as impeachment is about to come to a close, just days away, the well-timed leak, the predictable leak, came. Fleets goes on to write, I don't understand the need for a former national security advisor to publish a tell-all book critical of a president he served, especially during a presidential re-election campaign that will determine the fate of the country. There will be a time for Bolton to speak out without appearing to try to tip a presidential election. Former Secretary of Defense Robert Gates, who stepped down in June 2011, published a devastating book titled Duty, Memoirs of a Secretary at War, that detailed the incompetence of Vice President Joe Biden and the Obama National Security Council staff. He wanted to publish that before 2012, and then he decided, well, I better just wait until after the election. So he published it in January of 2014, after he was out of the White House. Fleets concludes his article. Gates established a principled precedent on how senior advisors to presidents should write about their experiences. Given Ambassador Bolton's long and distinguished record of government service, I believe it is vital that he follow this precedent. It is a shame to see that happen, to why everyone's trying to cash in on it. He's got to write that book right now. He has to write it before the election. I just want to conclude this segment with one more clip from Trump's defense team on Tuesday. And I really like this clip. It's from Patrick Philbin. And think about what William Barr and Mr. Gerald Flurry have written about the Democrats' ability to just divine and to move forward on subjective. He uses the term subjective motives. They just decide that it's wrong, and it doesn't need the evidence. They just know that the person is wrong. So this is Patrick Philbin. I believe this is from his defense on Tuesday.
And what we see in the House manager's charges and their definition of abuse of power is exactly antithetical to the framers' approach, because their very premise for their abuse of power charge is that it is entirely based on subjective motive, not objective standards, not predefined offenses, but the president can do something that is perfectly lawful, perfectly within his authority. But if the real reason, as Professor Dershowitz pointed out, that's the language from their report, the reason in the president's mind is something that they ferret out and decide is wrong, that becomes impeachable. And that's not a standard at all. It ends up being infinitely malleable.
The reason the president's mind is something that the reasoning in the president's mind is something that they ferret out and decide is wrong. And then that becomes impeachable. That's not a standard. Like he says, it becomes infinitely malleable. Where does this end? There's no stopping the destruction now of the Constitution if this is the path that they want to go down. I mean, who's to say your opinion of that man is any better than the next guy's opinion? This impeachment is destructive, and there's no going back. You cannot fix this mess. It cannot be undone now. Victor Davis Hanson wrote in his column on Tuesday, it's titled, When There Is No Normal. He says, one of the ancient and modern critiques of democracy is that radicals destroy norms for short-term political gain, norms that they themselves often later seek as refuge. We are now in a revolutionary cycle in which existing norms are considered obstacles to equality of result politics. The left believes that they will never need the institutions that they are distorting, but they will soon be the first to rue their own folly. Well, that would be the case if America survives this, but it doesn't look like it will. They don't care what the rules are now. They just want power. And that was always a warning or a critique of the Obama administration that Democrats or moderate Democrats would say, well, President Obama, if you do that, that means Republicans can just do it when they get in office. And that cycle goes on for a little while, but now it's the system, the traditions, the standards, the laws, it's going out the door. It's falling fast. Mr. Gerald Flurry's most recent article is titled, America Has Been Fundamentally Transformed, and that will be in the March 2020 Trumpet magazine. It's on the Trumpet website right now if you click the Gerald Flurry tab at the top of the website or his box in the top right. Again, that's titled America Has Been Fundamentally Transformed. He starts, America's government has been embroiled in a shameful impeachment charade for months now. The Democrats are demonstrating that there is virtually no limit to what they are willing to do to attack the president and undermine the last election and the next one. Meanwhile, revelations continue to emerge about their abuse of the intelligence agencies to spy on Americans, even the president himself. People need to understand what a dangerous threat this is to the very foundation of this nation. What is happening in the Democratic Party is an extension of and intensification of a process started by the previous president. When Barack Obama promised to fundamentally change America during his 2008 presidential run, few people knew what he really meant. Now that he is out of office, it is becoming clearer all the time that the change he was talking about was something far more dangerous than many people assumed. He meant changing America from a constitutional republic, and what we are witnessing in the country today shows that, to an alarming degree, he succeeded. A lot of people can say, well, Barack Obama is out of office, America under attack isn't relevant anymore. What we are seeing now are the fruits of that administration. America under attack is more relevant today probably than it ever was before. The cover-up, that's all the Mueller investigation was. That's all the impeachment trial is. President Trump, William Barr, they're exposing what was happening during those Obama years. Continuing on from Mr. Fleury's article. Then, during the 2016 presidential election, Brennan was instrumental. I'm skipping ahead here. He's talking about CIA Director John Brennan. I don't need to cover all of these details. He just talks about how the investigation into the Trump campaign got going and how they relied on the Steele dossier as the predicate for opening these investigations. Mr. Fleury writes, this opened the door for spying on everyone surrounding Donald Trump. This is about getting that FISA warrant. Conservative journalist Andrew McCarthy covers this history in his book, Ball of Collusion. He explains that the real collusion in the 2016 election was not between the Trump campaign and Russia. It was between the Clinton campaign and Obama's deep state. Had Hillary Clinton been elected, the destructive trends that unfolded during the Obama presidency would have continued unchecked and surely would have intensified. Many people believe it would have meant an end to our constitutional republic. The main purpose of counterintelligence operations is to keep the president informed, McCarthy writes. That is basic truth. Yet these agents are somehow convinced that their job is to overturn America's last election and destroy the president. They are focusing all their attention on hunting for crimes so they can bring him down and overthrow the government. That is a counterintelligence invasion, and it has unfolded right before our eyes. And it all revolves around former President Barack Obama. That must be our focus. He quotes Andrew McCarthy again, no administration in American history was more practiced in the dark arts of politicizing intelligence than President Obama's. That is an insightful statement. It's a very strong article. Like I said at the top of the show, it's around 6,000 words. It's a massive article, and it's a very important article. I implore you to read that. Again, go to the Trumpet website and read that article. That article explains the spiritual dimension to these events, and that dimension is the key to understanding everything that we're seeing today. That article explains the singular focus. It explains the goal of the Obama administration to fundamentally transform America, and he exposes what that politically correct language is really getting at. I'll leave it to you to read that article for yourself, because you really do need all of the context that's provided in there to understand just how strong it is. But I'd like to go through this article by Margaret Cleveland over at The Federalist, and keeping in context what Mr. Gerald Flurry has recently written about the spying that went on in the Obama administration. She writes in her January 28th article, the IG report also did more than confirm the Crossfire Hurricane team accused some Trump campaign communications, team accessed some Trump campaign communications. It established that accessing Page's communications with the Trump campaign was the goal of the FISA order. The goal was not, this is my words, the goal was not to find out if Carter Page was a Russian agent. It was to discover if President Trump was a Russian agent. The FBI, they just assumed that the Steele dossier was right. Well, they didn't just assume. They knew it was wrong. They knew there was nothing there. Rather than trying to vet the sources, they simply decided and presumed the president was guilty and instead decided to vet the man running for president. And again, why wasn't he off limits during a campaign? If Joe Biden is off limits during a campaign, why wasn't President Trump? Cleveland goes on to talk about a number of confidential human sources. These are individuals that do not work directly for the FBI, but provide information for the FBI, and the FBI uses them. There were a number of these, more than 2 or 3. At one point, the FBI even considered instructing one of them to get a job in the Trump administration. You've heard about Stephen Halper. He was working for the FBI. He secretly recorded conversations of Carter Page, George Papadopoulos, and Sam Clovis. He's a senior member of the Trump campaign. There's no telling how much information they collected through all of this. And the IG report, it only covers the material that was exculpatory for Carter Page. It only talked about the evidence that was collected to justify the FISA. It doesn't talk about the probably, I would say, hundreds of thousands, perhaps millions of documents that were uncovered. Maybe millions is a bit of a stretch. Maybe even hundreds of thousands is a stretch. But a lot of information, so much so that as soon as they got that first FISA, they were already applying for the second one halfway through the first 3-month period because they couldn't get through all of the information in 3 months. They had just pulled in everything. And when you look into what that sort of spying that's suddenly permitted now because they have this FISA, it's not just online surveillance. I mean, they're getting his emails. They have permission to open his physical mail. They can search his home. It's pretty much the government has authorized you to have free reign in this man's life. And they had it for almost an entire year. One conversation that was secretly recorded of Carter Page was transcribed, and it was 163 pages long. And we're supposed to believe the Obama DOJ didn't know anything about the Trump campaign, wasn't spying on the Trump campaign, was just had this well-intentioned desire to find out if President Trump was a Russian agent. I mean, it's laughable to hear them say we were spying on Carter Page. The Steele dossier that it was built on accuses the president of being cultivated by Russia. It's so obvious the goal of that FISA was to get to President Trump. Cleveland's article goes on. She talks about more of these confidential human sources. I'll just read one final quote here. The FBI didn't limit its spying efforts to outsourced human sources. Rather, in addition to using Halper and several others, on August 17, 2016, the FBI dispatched a supervisor of the Crossfire Hurricane team, this is believed to be Joe Pientka, to a private security briefing for then-candidate Trump and Flynn. Now, this happened several times. President Trump, at the time, he was the Republican nominee, and the FBI gives the the leaders of each campaign, the nominee for each campaign, they give them like a defensive briefing, or they just update them on here's what we're looking at, here's what Russia is up to. They just talk to them. It's supposed to be a briefing. But the FBI, when they went to go and speak directly to President Trump, they weren't there to inform him. They were there to surveil him. They made memos of these interviews that they would upload into their databases, because what the briefing actually was their opportunity to bring up Steele's documents, to bring up those rumors in front of President Trump and see how he responded. It was not a friendly briefing. It was an interrogation, and they lied directly to his face. Jim Comey did that on January 6th. He said that was a defensive meeting, and it was the same thing. He went in there to interrogate President Trump. And not only that, he used his memos that he took of that meeting, memos that he would only be able to attain because he's an employee of the federal government. And then he walked away from that meeting and decided, well, those were his personal memos and that they wouldn't have to be entered into the FBI database. They wouldn't have to be reviewed for classification, and he was free to leak them to his friend or to instruct his friend to leak them to the New York Times. It is disgusting, the amount of lying that went on here. Cleveland talks about how much information just in the IG report alone is still redacted. 2 senators wrote a letter to William Barr asking him to remove some of those redactions because, well, they have seen them and they believe that the factual information in those footnotes actually contradicts what witnesses told Horowitz. I'll conclude here with just one final section from Mr. Gerald Fleury's article, America Has Been Fundamentally Transformed. He starts this section, it's about the coup. Mark Zaid, he's the attorney for the Ukrainian whistleblower, tweeted on January 30th, 2017, just days after President Donald Trump was inaugurated, "Coup has started. First of many steps. Rebellion. Impeachment will follow ultimately. Lawyers." Later that day, he tweeted, "Coup has started. As one falls, 2 more will take their place. Rebellion, impeachment." Mr. Fleury says, in other words, if someone like James Comey gets fired, 2 more will rise up from the deep state to carry on the mission, and that is exactly what has happened. A coup is a violent or illegal seizure of power. That is precisely what they have been working to do. A violent or illegal seizure of power, and here you have the lawyers representing the prosecutors trying to get President Trump removed from office, tweeting that a coup has started. An illegal seizure of power out in the open, saying this is the goal. Mr. Fleury continues on. In December, the Justice Department watchdog reprimanded the FBI for lying on the Steele dossier to obtain its FISA warrant. In a 476-page report, the Inspector General identified at least 17 significant errors or omissions in the Carter Page FISA applications. In reality, those were not 17 errors. They were 17 treasonous crimes. The whole process was aimed at staging a coup. These people believed the end justifies any means. They will lie, defame, slander, anything they have to do to get rid of Trump. Do we want a constitutional republic? The Democratic leftists do not. All these activities that are being exposed show that in many ways they have already changed this nation from a constitutional republic to a nation governed by something even worse than communist philosophy. Again, a very strong article. And again, I encourage you to go and read that so that you get all of the context there to these very powerful statements that Mr. Fleury is making. You need that spiritual dimension to understand the events that you are seeing each day in the news. That is all that I have time for today. Thank you again for listening. If you have any comments, you can send that to td@kpcg.fm. Thank you for listening.